nine, and then nine, 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 and then nine, nine, hi, nine, and then nine, 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 nine. Hit it, nine, 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 oh, oh, hit it, nine, 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 oh, hit it, nine, 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 oh, hit it, nine, 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 oh. Hit a nine nine and nine 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 and a nine nine and nine 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 and a nine nine and nine 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 nine. And a nine nine and nine nine I nine and nine nine and a nine nine and nine 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 and a nine nine oh and a nine nine and oh and a nine nine and no 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 and a nine nine and nine no. Shalom, shalom, friends. Thank you so much for being here. Great to see you for class 20 of 50 transformative psychology studies and theories and Jewish perspectives on them. Today, we're going to dive into Tversky and Kahneman. Tversky and Kahneman, very interesting stuff. And let's start with a poll question on this. So, only two choices this time. Most humans primarily make rational, intentional choices. Most humans primarily make irrational choices unconsciously. What do you think? Are most people generally throughout the day making rational, intentional choices or making irrational choices unconsciously? Okay, 50-50 split. Half think most people are making rational, intentional choices. When you're in the cereal aisle, people are not just buying the same cereal they bought for 30 years or buying the cereal that they like the commercial song. They have carefully investigated the price and the ingredients. You think when people are choosing the car they want, they're not just doing the one that looks cool or in the moment feels nice, but they have carefully investigated various safety aspects and the price and various aspects of their needs and comfort throughout the day, not just as consumers. Okay, very interesting. And those who think it's irrational think there's a host of unconscious things going on. All right. Okay. In terms of politics, I'll leave that one over there. Okay. One of the great shifts of economic theory in the 20th century was the advent of behavioral economics. Traditional economics operated under the assumption of rational actors, that individuals make economic decisions based on a rational, controlled analysis of cost and benefits. Therefore, in classical economics, expected utility theory predicts that when faced with a financial decision that has some element of uncertainty, most people will make the decision that has the greatest chance of the highest utility, i.e., best possible outcome. However, the truth is that such theories are normative, meaning they tell us how we should act, but often fail to account for how people actually act. This is where the 20th century field of behavior economics comes in. In contrast to traditional economics, behavioral economics acknowledges that people often do make optimal or rational decisions. As a yield, behavioral economics is concerned with the psychological factors that drive decision making. So, two of the most important figures in behavioral economics were not trained as economists, but rather psychologists. Amos Tversky, who lived 1937 to 1996, and Daniel Kahneman, who lived 1934 to 2024. Actually, in 2 days is his yahrzeit. He passed away a year ago, March 27th, and was just in the news. He died at age 90 by assisted suicide. He went to Switzerland from Israel because engaged in assisted suicide at age 90. Together, these two Israeli psychologists made a huge impact on economics by developing what is called prospect theory. Prospect theory concerns how we make decisions under conditions of risk, studying how people think about loss and gain. As we will see, this theory has been used to analyze not only individual decision-making, but also decision-making in the context of international relations. Okay, very much in the news these days, a lot of hot things going on international relations. How are people making decisions? People whose decision-making processes we trust, at least. In a profoundly influential research paper first published in 1979, Tversky and Kahneman demonstrated that an aversion to suffering loss drives a lot of human decision-making, even when those decisions are not rationally justified. Maybe you like a good game of craps on a cruise ship now and again. I've never been on a cruise ship, but I do know a little bit about craps, having only played 3 or 4 times. The classic example is that if a person is presented with an opportunity to either win $250, guaranteed 250 bucks, or to take a gamble in which there's a 25% chance of winning $1,000, but a 75% chance of winning nothing, the majority of people choose the guaranteed $250. This is in keeping with expected utility theory, as it is a statistically sound decision. However, if presented with a slightly inverted scenario, a guaranteed loss of $750, or a gamble with 75% chance to lose $1,000 and a 25% chance to lose nothing, the majority of people will take the gamble, motivated by the slim possibility of losing nothing at all. Was that too fast, or do I need to say that again? Some people say, okay, all right, let me say that one more time, just because it's kind of key to what we're saying. The classic example is that if a person is presented with an opportunity to either win $250 guaranteed, or to take a gamble in which there's a 25% chance of winning $1,000, but a 75% chance of winning nothing, the majority of people choose the guaranteed $250. This is in keeping with expected utility theory. However, if presented with a slightly inverted scenario, a guaranteed loss of $750, or a gamble with a 75% chance to lose $1,000 and a 25% chance to lose nothing, the majority of people will take the gamble, motivated by the slim possibility of losing nothing at all. People are motivated by not having a loss, as opposed to having a larger gain. Statistically, these two scenarios present the same amount of risk. According to expected utility theory, people should take the guaranteed loss of $250, just as the majority chose the guaranteed win of $250. The reason is simply that the odds are 3 to 1 that you will lose $1,000. So a rational actor would take into account that statistical probability of loss and not risk it. However, Tversky and Kahneman showed us that while people do make the rational choice when it comes to winning money, their aversion to loss causes them to irrationally gamble on the unlikely possibility that they can avoid loss altogether. We want no loss. Our fear of loss outweighs our rationality. Sometimes these issues are easier to picture without the element of statistics. So let me give a rote example. Let's say this Saturday night, you have tickets to the Lakers game. Perhaps you don't care about the Lakers. Let's say the Suns game. But perhaps you don't care about the Suns. Okay, let's say, who should I say? All right, we'll just say let's say the Lakers game, because they got Luka and LeBron. But when Saturday night rolls around, you don't really feel up to going to the game, and you'd rather stay home, make popcorn, and watch a movie on Netflix. Many people will do the thing they want to do less. In this case, go to the game, even though it will bring them less pleasure, because they don't want to feel they're losing the money they spent on the tickets. That's the same kind of reasoning that makes it hard for people to leave a long-term romantic relationship that's not working for them anymore. After investing so much time and energy, to walk away would feel like a loss. As a result of this aversion to perceived loss, some people will stay in a relationship even if what is best for their future is something else. As Tversky was known to say, people are not so complicated. Relationships between people are complicated. All right, let me make sure the Lakers game makes sense, because I think it's key to understanding this, right? You bought the tickets, a few $100 for your 2 tickets, right? The night rolls around, you'd rather stay home. You will get more pleasure from staying home than going, but you can't handle the loss of losing the hundreds of dollars that you paid for the tickets. So you do the thing that brings you less pleasure to avoid the loss of the cost, right? Irrational, right? irrational. You should do what gives you more pleasure. Who cares where you spent the money? Tversky and Kahneman's findings that aversion to loss can motivate decision making more than expected utility constituted a profound paradigm shift in the field of economics. In fact, their work was so influential that it resulted in the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics being awarded to Kahneman. Had Tversky been alive, he passed in 1996, he would have certainly shared the prize. The intellectual partnership between the two men was legendary. They worked in constant conversation, alternating between English and Hebrew. They produced their writing jointly, without clear distinctions between what was Kahneman's idea and what was Tversky's. They collaborated so closely that in order to figure out who would have the honor of being the lead author on their first paper, they simply flipped a coin. From that point on, they alternated the honor for their decades of work together. Regarding their collaboration, Kahneman wrote, "A joint mind that was better than our separate minds." In the decades since their work shook up the field of economics, many researchers have studied the implications of loss aversion in decision making. One interesting area this aversion plays out in is the realm of buying insurance. You ever bought insurance? Maybe you're a seller of insurance as a hobby. A study in 2010 by Justin Sidnor, a microeconomist at Case Western Reserve University, looked at why consumers, in his words, appear to pay a large amount to insure against very modest financial losses. Right? The dumbest thing I do is buy dog insurance. Anyone else do this dumb thing? I can't stop doing it, even though it's dumb. I pay $50 a month, and they cap off the award of like $1,000. And it's like impossible to even get it. But I keep paying this $50 a month because I can't handle the dog needing a $1,000 surgery and having to pay that. So I'm aware of how dumb it is, but I still buy this dog insurance. I hope they don't sue me if they're listening to this, Hartville Pet Insurance. Anyways, they're probably not listening, but I'd be very honored if they were. He found that against their own best interest, many people choose an insurance plan, get dental insurance. I also make the great mistake of dental insurance. He found that against their own best interest, many people choose an insurance plan with a much lower deductible, i.e. the amount they will have to pay out of pocket before the insurance coverage kicks in. The lower your deductible, the higher your monthly premiums. Given the choice between $100, $250, $500, and $1,000 deductibles, just as examples, 48% of people choose a $500 deductible, while only 17% choose the $1,000 deductible. The kicker, those who choose lower deductibles paid about 5 times more than the expected value for their insurance. I can send you the source for that if you want to see it. Again, we see fear of loss overpowering rationality. Another expression of loss aversion comes in the form of what is called myopic loss aversion, a term coined in 1995 by researchers Shlomo Benartzi and Richard Taylor. By the way, I'm not specifically looking for Israelis here. These are just, we just live in a world where Israelis are at the front lines of a lot of great scholarship. The theory of myopic loss aversion is a continuation of Tversky and Kahneman's work, examining the heavy emphasis people place on short-term losses. Benartzi and Thaler looked specifically at investors' relationships to stocks and bonds. Bonds are riskless, but far underperform stocks, which have much higher returns in the long run. So why are bonds valued so highly? It comes down to myopic loss aversion, our bias towards short-term losses. A few years later, Uri Genizi, another Israeli-sounding name, Uri Genizi and Jan Potters continued this work, confirming that investors tend to be short-sighted when evaluating their portfolios. Economics and the consumer marketplace are not the only realms where loss aversion plays out. In more recent years, researchers have begun to study how political strategy is deeply shaped by prospect theory. Kurt Wayland, a researcher at the University of Texas at Austin, hook 'em horns, has found that bold and politically risky domestic initiatives are far more likely to be undertaken by vulnerable regimes than by those at the height of their power. This means that when faced with the possibility of losing power entirely, governments begin to take riskier gambles. Wayland examined Latin American governments. very much in the news these days. Similar results were found by Barbara Viss and Kees van Kersbergen in their investigation of welfare reforms by the Italian government. Prospect theory is also used by theorists of international relations to deepen our understanding of various issues in world politics, including those related to security. For example, it's been observed that in times of war, meaning when operating in the domain of loss, policymakers are more likely to take gambles than they would otherwise avoid, such as ordering particularly risky missions or implementing radical domestic reforms in order to support military efforts. More than once, prospect theory has explained foreign policy decisions that on the surface seem to be anomalies, defying the expectations of rational choice theory. Rose McDermott, professor of political science at Brown, has found that American foreign policy reflects that when decision makers are faced with loss, they are far more likely to make risky decisions, looking specifically at the Suez Crisis, the U-2 affair, the decision surrounding the admission of the Shah of Iran to the US in 1979, and the attempted rescue of the American hostages in Iran in 1980. All in all, psychology has shown us that as humans, we are programmed to assign excessive, often irrational, weight to possible cases of loss. At its core, prospect theory examines how fear of loss shapes decision making. It is fear that causes people to make decisions that do not align with their best interest, i.e., they do not maximize utility. All in all, psychology has shown us that as humans, we are programmed to assign excessive, often irrational, turning now to the Jewish tradition. I'd like us to consider how fear, loss, and utility are acknowledged by our sources. By the way, today's a short presentation. I'm getting close to the end already. In Jewish ethics, we evaluate a decision based on whether it aligns with our values, not necessarily on maximizing wealth, but on maximizing goodness. Again and again, Jewish sources from the Torah through today encourage us to be conscious and intentional in our choices, not driven by irrational forces. Often acting in alignment with our values means not being controlled by the fear that drives prospect theory, but instead moving from a place of courage. Courage, sometimes called ometz lev, literally heart strength, in Hebrew is an important value in the Jewish tradition. In Torah, we are several times encouraged to be chazak ve'amatz, strong and courageous. In Talmud, the rabbis use this phrase as a justification for the teaching that four things require strength: Torah, good deeds, prayer, and the way of the land, i.e., proper behavior. Now, I don't think Torah is necessarily encouraging us to take imprudent gambles in terms of our financial decisions or otherwise. But I do think that Torah is reminding us that we sometimes need to take risks in order to make decisions that align with our moral values. And these decisions may well be financial ones. Let me give one example that's close to home for me. Having met with a leader of an LGBTQ group last week, he told me that signs are looking likely that this current presidential administration is going to try to strip the 501c3 status of groups involved with LGBTQ advocacy. Now, you might say, how is that even possible? But we might question how lots of things are possible. And won't it be challenged in the courts? But yes, what will be the power of those courts, right? That as they work to take down DEI, that groups presumably engage in any types of DEI efforts advocating for minority groups in one way or another, that they will be at risk. So, do those of us who view our work driven by Jewish values as advocating for minorities, right, and advocating for the vulnerable say, whoa, we should stop that advocacy ASAP to preserve institutions, right, from such attacks, or do we continue to operate by our mission? So anyways, for example, I've elsewhere argued in just the last year, actually, that all people of faith should stand against China's ongoing genocide of the Uyghur people. My children are very upset with me that we can't take a vacation to China one day. Because it's likely I'm on the anti-China list, given my anti-Uyghur genocide advocacy. And anyways, that's a different conversation. The Uyghurs are an ethnic Muslim minority that the Communist Party of China is attempting to wipe out by use of forced sterilization, internment in so-called re-education camps, separation of children from their families, systematic torture and sexual violence. What does this have to do with our financial decisions here in the West? Well, part of the Uyghur genocide is that the Chinese government forces Uyghur detainees to perform unpaid labor in various factories. These goods often enter the American marketplace. Like we all have these goods in our home. I believe that in this instance, to act with courage is to continue to push for greater supply chain transparency so that companies and individuals can avoid purchasing unethical products from unethical sellers. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA, was an important start, but it's just the beginning. It's so weak, though, by the way. So, for example, we did, in a bipartisan effort a year or two ago, bipartisan efforts, there's so few things that get done, but this was successfully done, that we banned imports from those regions of China. But why was that ineffective? It's called repackaging, right? Those regions simply now ship to Italy, and now they repackages it as an Italian product, right? And now it bypasses that American legislation of banning the imports from that region. So banning imports sounds like like a legislative win, but there's so many loopholes around it. Another example of a loophole: it only applies to certain size of shipments. If a shipment is done in small packaging rather than in large bulk deliveries, then it doesn't get regulated. So it's a problem. In any case, it's not easy to change our purchasing habits based on consumer ethics. We might already feel invested in a consumer identity tied to a particular brand, or perhaps we have an established sales relationship. In these cases, when information emerges about unethical practices on the part of a manufacturer or seller, it actually takes tremendous courage to change sellers. Another thing, we've been talking about whether we should be engaged in an anti-Tesla protest act, but now being called domestic terrorism to protest, Tesla being considered, potentially domestic terrorism, gives people pause and how they're going to protest, the kind of harm being done right now. If this sounds like a purely modern issue, it's worth noting that Jewish tradition is deeply concerned with questions of consumer ethics and the supply chain. The Mishnah repeatedly deals with the ethics not just of stealing, but of buying goods that have been stolen. You can look here at Mishnah Bava Kama 10.1 and the Gemara on Bava Kama 119a around whether you can buy things that are connected to stolen products. Regarding the halachic laws of theft, the Rambam summarizes that it's a particularly grave transgression to buy stolen goods from a thief, as it, quote, strengthens the hands of those who violate the law and causes the thief to continue to steal. Meaning, without a buyer for stolen goods, the thief would not steal. So by purchasing the stolen goods, we're providing an incentive to keep stealing. The Rambam's teaching is just as true on a much larger scale of the Chinese government. If we keep purchasing goods made with Uyghur forced labor, then we're providing an incentive for the practice to continue. Always, we should have the courage to open our eyes to the various actors involved in a consumer transaction. Now, stealing is very complicated. It might sound black and white, like, oh, I walk into Target and I pickpocket something. That's stealing, right? But there's a lot of gray areas. What about stolen wages? Right? Well, obviously, if you steal someone's tips, that's stealing. But what if you find out that a certain company pays women, 70 cents to the dollar of what a man makes? Is that stealing? Right? Are they stealing the time from women? What if you find that undocumented people at a company are paid below minimum wage because they're afraid to claim their rightful wages? Is that stealing? So not contributing to the theft. Like, how wide of a net is that? Another way we might resist our own aversion to financial loss is in the realm of tzedakah, charity. The great Hasidic master, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, taught that we often get in our own way when it comes to acting in faith. that it takes courage to overcome mental obstacles, including matters of finance. He wrote that a person's money is related to their soul and that they dedicate so much effort and risk so much danger to earn it. Given how much of ourselves we pour into making a living, it's quite counterintuitive that we would surrender any of that money to charity. That act, right, wrote Rabbi Nachman, is analogous to giving up their soul. Right? We feel our money is so deeply ours. We gave our lives for this money. Right? However, giving generously is exactly what the tradition demands of us. To put this in terms of prospect theory, by keeping the Jewish value of giving to charity, by acting in a way that aligns with our own values, we're asking others to embrace a decision with guaranteed loss. Here I'm going to plug VBM's Life and Legacy program, that if our money is indeed connected to our souls, then when our souls ascend on high, they ascend even higher if that which we've dedicated our lives to continues to keep good going in the world. Okay, friends, to conclude, as prospect theory has shown us, we are all deeply afraid of loss. This is one of the many reasons that acting with integrity requires courage. I'm reminded of another teaching of Rabbi Nachman, that the world is like a very narrow bridge, and the main thing is to not fear at all. It takes great courage to overcome our fear of personal loss in order to live according to our deepest values. To do so, we must, in the words of Pirkei Avot, be as brave as a lion. All right, dear friends, I want to pause there. I'd love to hear your thoughts on behavioral economics, international relations, on courage, whatever you're thinking about today. Hi, Lauren Blatt, up in Canada. How's the weather in Canada today?
Oh, you wouldn't believe. We had like 20 oh, this is Celsius. We had like 20 degrees last week. It looked like spring. We thought, hooray, the groundhog didn't lie. And then we got snow yesterday.
Okay.
So we call
Okay,
that food spring.
I want to offer our sincerest condolences. We do not want Canada as a state of America. We
No,
do not want to tariff your goods. I think most of us
no.
want to buy your products. Please accept my condolences on behalf of our VBM community. Also, as a
Thank
born
you.
Canadian.
Thank you. And buy Canadian,
Buy Canadian. Okay.
which was part of what I was going to say, because it's interesting because you're talking about the intersection of how much, pardon me, better, how much risk one can take versus moral courage, right? And I mean, I'm probably the most averse person I know, yet I made Aliyah, which was financially the most stupid thing one could do, unless you're rich, and then you just get a little less rich. But, and right now, like in Canada, we're boycotting American goods. Most of us, we're not traveling to the US, but in some cases, buying the Canadian good may be more expensive for me, but there's no way I'm going to buy the American good. So that's like moral courage. And I really think that consumers together as a group can do a lot. Like when you say boycott China. It's really important. It's really hard because almost everything is made in China, and we may have to pay more for something made, in your case, in the US, but hopefully in Canada, and for us in Canada, but also England and France and whatever. But sorry about that. But anyways, it's really quite a balance. But thank you. This is a very interesting topic.
Yeah,
And go
thank you, Lauren.
Canada. Yay.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you for that. And yeah, you make a good point around personality. We do have different personalities around risk aversion, and and that is worth, and those personalities do evolve. And and we may become more conservative with risks as we get older, and all of that is okay. And there's also people who might have more privilege to take risks. And you're exactly right. Choosing something like spending a little bit more when one is on tight ends to live one's values is a good example of that. Yeah. Hi, Matthew.
So, two comments, and this predates a lot of people. If you go back to the S&L meltdown like 30, 40 years ago, a lot of the bankers whose banks went bust actually were making very rational decisions because they were so far behind in such difficult circumstances, but they realized they had FDIC insurance for 95% of the people who had funds in the bank. Therefore, you could gamble, and it didn't matter if you lost, you wiped out your shareholders, but none of the depositors would lose money. And I was involved with some of this, so I know this. So rationally, they gambled everything. They would lose their own money, but they actually protected everyone. The flip side of that was I once recommended to a client, they put all of the employees' profit sharing money into banks that would deemed to fail.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way the law worked, everyone's individual account was insured. No one had more than that. Instead of earning 3% in the bank, you could earn 9%. And the worst thing that happened is the government gave you back all your money. So sometimes what looks like a rational, by the way, the chairman of the board of this public company said to me, it's a brilliant idea, but we really can't tell people. We're looking to invest the employees' money in banks that are going to fail. But it's an interesting thing that sometimes what looks like an irrational act is really a rational act and can be for the benefit of everyone. Because if some of these banks actually turned it around with these risky investments, it was the fraudulent ones that didn't, the people in Arizona. But it's just sometimes you have to look at other issues. And the banks that we were involved with that basically said, we're going to protect our depositors. We may turn it around, but if we don't, no one is going to lose money who's not an investor in the bank. So it's a very interesting decision that was made. I was involved with 3 banks at the time. So
Very interesting. I find that to be a very relevant and helpful example, the big banking industry. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, hi, Gary.
Good morning, everyone. What you mentioned about buying products from maybe companies that pay less for women or immigrants or whatever. But I grew up in California, and I remember back in the 70s with Cesar Chavez, with the grapes. It was easy to boycott not eating grapes because they basically all came from California. But now in a universal society, business society, it's really difficult to decide what you can buy and what you can't buy. You go into Costco, vegetables are from Mexico and blueberries are from Peru. And as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of stuff that's covered up that we don't know. Athletic shoes don't come from this country. Phones, Cheryl just said, are all made in China or Taiwan or someplace. So we do try to pick out the things that we want, and that is pick out things that we will not buy. But how much of a impact we're making is really hard to determine, other than just our own personal choices. So I just thought that the world has changed very radically since the 70s and 60s, and the economy has changed. So I just wanted to bring that up. I don't have any solutions to it. Otherwise, maybe just go out in the forest and live off of fruits and things that we get, and be one of those types,
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Gary. I think that's a great point, and that's a fascinating movement you referenced. And yeah, I think it's all worth us thinking about. I think I don't know so many people who make every consumer choice as an ethical one, but maybe we can all think of one. If there's not one we make currently, is there one ethical consumer choice you want to make, and just to kind of start from there. And there's so many different areas, whether it's fair trade, it's animals, it's workers, it's environment, it's not supporting genocidal regimes, whatever it is. I know some people who only buy Israeli wine because they want to support Israel. It's not just the boycotting side, it's also the supporting side as well. Places that have good practices. So yeah, thank you for that. Interesting. Hi, Steve. You want to jump in, Steve?
I think a lot of our risk acceptance and risk aversion is contingent on our age and on our financial wherewithal. I will be willing, and the thing about which we are risk adverse or risk accepting, I will make possibly preposterous to some trades in the market because I feel very confident from my experience. But other things I am very timid about, such as my health. I'm overly conscientious now about everything I do health wise. So I think a lot has to do with our circumstance and our age. Initially, I thought that youth would be much, much more aggressive in terms of assuming risk. But when you're trying to pay down your mortgage, your kids are young, you might not be able to step over that ever widening uh, uh, piece of water that other people are willing to jump to. My dad uh, had on his birth certificate his birthplace as Montreal. He was never born in Montreal. He was born in Latvia. And I asked him, why did you do that? And he said, I am so scared, and these aren't his words, my words, of anti Semitism here in Baltimore that I would rather list Montreal as my birthplace than Latvia, because if people saw Latvia, they might be immediately anti Semitic, but they saw Montreal, they wouldn't be. Uh, so I'm rambling on here, but I think a lot has contingency. And one final thing, when did Moses become less risk adverse in terms of Torah? Wasn't he very timid at first about accepting leadership, and he stuttered, and he wanted Aaron to help him present his case, and I might be totally wrong. And what made him more confident? That's it.
Wow, Steve, you gave us so much to think about here. I'm happy to take a first stab, and then I'd welcome others as well. So it's actually interesting what you say there, because I think what gave Moshe um, I think there's two transformative moments, maybe more, but at least two. One is identity clarity as to who he is. That's identity clarity seems to be a transformative moment for him. The second is that he's not alone. I think people can handle losses better when they feel they're not alone in the risk. Kind of the divine solidarity, so to speak, seems to embolden his ability to walk that walk. But I don't believe there's any evidence that his stutter ever goes away. That the barrier for his leadership is always there, but he's kind of emboldened both by that identity formation and that sense of not being alone. A few other things you sparked for me in this. One is around in criminal justice, our conversation of deterrence. Does deterrence work? Does the loss aversion psychology apply? If someone is thinking about doing a crime, how deterred are they by the possible punishment? And if the possible punishment is 6 months in jail versus 6 years, is that a factor in them in being a psychological deterrence? Is the loss of a DUI, someone drinks 5 beers, right? Not one, but they drink 5 beers and then they drive. Is that sense that they might get a DUI? Like how effective is that for a deterrence, and which type of personality does that deter? So I think that's another interesting thing. In regards to your father, who you've talked about a number of times in regards to kind of his fear of anti-Semitism at the time, and as an immigrant, I totally get it. As a non-immigrant, I get it. But the whole choice of an immigrant of in terms of loss aversion, of leaving with the possibility of being detained or beaten or moved to a very uncertain situation. I think for many who've always been a citizen or multi-generational Americans, it's hard for them to understand the immigrant journey and how the kind of loss aversion also applies here. Another area I'm thinking about that you mentioned, as you said, you're timid in some areas of your life, but as it comes to stocks, you're bullish and confident, you know. But I wonder, as it relates to dignity, how we think of loss. Someone is afraid of speaking up because I might be shamed. someone might shame me if I take a stand. I have a friend who views things differently than me, and they might be upset with me. Like, how do we think of our reputation or our dignity as it relates to the loss of taking a stand? I think many people are struggling with that right now. Um, and then the last thing, just on your point about stocks and bonds, I think that and being younger and older, I think I gave an unfair knock earlier to purchasing of bonds. But it might be silly if someone is 25 and they want to leave the investment there for 30 years, right? It might be silly. But someone who's in retirement who might want the funds next year might be very smart to be more invested in bonds than the volatility of stocks. And so it is very dependent on context, of course. In any case, Steve, I think those are really interesting insights. Yeah, hi, Stan.
Morning. When I was a young lawyer, I used to do criminal defense work, and you talk about the gamble or the risk. I had a client who was charged with selling heroin, and since he had a previous conviction of doing something, he was looking at 10 years hard flat time, no parole in that 10 years. They offered us 5 years. I said, "What do you think?" He said, "There's no difference between 5 years and 10 years," and we tried the case. And by the way, we won, but he took that risk, which I think is much riskier than what you're talking about. Is it $250 or $1,000? It doesn't matter. As somebody who likes to play Las Vegas a little bit, I'd be willing to play money at a $5 crap table, hoping that I might win a few $100s. I am afraid to play at a $25 crap table where I might lose $2,000 in 10 minutes. So I think that the real difference between wealthy people, super wealthy people, and regular people who who've made money, not from their parents or relatives, but on their own, is what Steve said, risk avergence. Most of us are afraid of risking what we have. And
very interesting.
I think
Stan, do you think most people on trial, if the choice was to fight and maybe get 0 years or maybe get 10 years, or take a bargain or take an agreement and land on 5 years, what do you think most people would choose?
Well, I think first of all, you ask, is it a deterrent? I have never met a criminal defendant who thought he or she was going to get caught. Okay, they don't think they're going to get caught, so it's not a deterrent. Okay, it's just what the punishment is. It has to be a really good deal, and I wouldn't recommend. I would only recommend to the person if I thought we had no chance of winning. If there's a way of winning the case, of course, but you never know what's going to happen during a case. So, very few cases go to trial in this country. Yeah. Maybe 2%, 3%. Yeah. Right. Those are all on TV for the most part. Right. But basically, people will only take a chance. First of all, they give you the right to remain silent. Most criminal defendants don't avail themselves. Most of them talk. And once they talk, they're done. And so generally, most people will take a plea bargain. The state wants a plea bargain. The judge wants a plea bargain. And everybody wants to do that. And that's generally what happens, unless, maybe the Supreme Court says you're immune. That's different. But it's a toss-up.
Very interesting.
But I'm just saying, when you're talking about risk and you talk about, one of your examples was, I can guarantee to get 250, but you're giving me that 250. I don't have any skin in the game. I'm either going to get 250 or 1,000. So if I didn't win at all, I'd have nothing. But that's how I started. But if you made me pay to get that chance to win 250 or 1,000, let's say I had to pay $50, then you think about it differently. Yeah. So that's what.
Okay, very interesting. Love it. Cheryl, you want to jump in, or you want us to come back to you?
No, I'm not. I'm good.
Okay, great. All right, we'll come back to you if you want to jump in. Hi, Gary.
I want to go back to the point you made about deterrence and Moses. So if Moses would have known that he couldn't get into Eretz Yisrael when he struck the rock at the end of his life, do you think it would have made a difference? Because he struck the rock and then said for water, and then God said, you're not a good leader anymore, and you can't go in. So
Wow.
I'm curious what your thought is on that.
Oh, that's so interesting, Gary. I've never heard the question. I've never heard the question posed actually. Um, and actually, is it fair? Um, is it fair to, to be punished for something, assuming we view that as a punishment,
Yeah.
if it hasn't been already articulated as kind of a law? Is an interesting question. And would he have done differently? Um, yeah, I think most certainly he would have done differently had he known that. I think it was very important to him to experience that next stage. And I think it's an unintended consequence of his choice. So I think that's a fascinating question. Yeah, an interesting related midrash is a fascinating midrash that talks about three biblical figures that, had they known their story would have been written in the Tanakh, they wouldn't have done what they had done. Right? They sort of thought, "I'm doing what I'm doing," but I never knew that for all of history, this would be recorded, right? Um, and so, I'd like to think we all would live like that. That some arbitrary moment of our life may be the moment that defines us ultimately, not the thing that we wish. But so we should live each moment as if it's maybe our defining moment. But yeah, Gary, awesome question, Lauren. Hi, Lauren.
Whoops, back to Gary's question. I had always been like really bothered by the unfairness of this judgment on Moshe. But then I was reading more Midrashim and more commentaries that really he was unfortunately the wrong leader for the time, for the second generation to go into Eretz Israel. And although, like maybe he should have been at least allowed to go, but let Yehoshua be the leader, people would never have seen Yehoshua as the leader. So as tragic as it is, and I always cry at the end of it, I think Moshe, if he hadn't done that, he might have done something else. But I think it was just a decision by Hashem that this is not the man to take, sad as it is and unfair as it is, this is not the man to take the people into Eretz Yisrael and to conquer the land. It's the only way I can live with that.
Great. So yeah, good. So one view is that it is just a straight up punishment, and that anybody would get the punishment. The other is that he's held to the highest standard, and he's just a different set of others. And another, like Lauren is saying here, is that it's not really a punishment as much as just him not being the right person. So then why attach it at all to the rock is an interesting question. Right? If he's just not the right leader. But yeah, I think it's a fascinating case. Anyone else want to jump in here? Hi, Steve, you're back. Hi, Steve.
This is very unrelated. The
Sorry.
Nagun that I don't know if it's called humming or singing, you present to us before every lecture. And I don't mean to sound silly, is that kind of like the Star Spangled Banner before a game that are Naguns sung for anything else other than a lecture?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because that gives me the opportunity to invite everyone to the Phoenix Suns game this Sunday, because it's Jewish Heritage Night and my kids
Oh,
will be on the
wow.
court for the national anthem.
Oh boy.
They won the raffle. They won the raffle of Jewish Heritage Night. So that was just a way to getting us to buy tickets. I did not want to buy tickets, but once they won the raffle of that, I said, okay, I guess we got to buy the tickets because they don't do it. But yeah, they were actually asking me, I said, why do we sing the national anthem before sports games? And I couldn't really give them a good answer. I mean, I gave them kind of, something about national unity and national pride, and how, it's more than just two teams competing, where there's a unity that we have in the stadium. But like, they weren't really convinced by my explanation as to why we sing the national anthem before sports. But I think the Nigun before learning is primarily that I think it's a few things for me, at least. Partially, it's about getting present in this space, and connecting us together in this space. And the wordless melody, I think, can be powerful in spaces beyond the learning space. For me, I find it most powerful in bedtime, visiting people bedside when there's not much more to say. For example, our friend Yitzhak David Lieberman, who just passed away a month or so ago. When I was bedside a few times with him, I sung some melodies, um, and I particularly like it when someone is not, totally comfortable in Hebrew, so they don't know all Hebrew words, but it's a way to engage in a melody that one can access beyond the words. So I think it's good bedside. I think it's nice, in learning experiences. I also think it can be a calming mechanism for someone just to take a break and engage in a melody. So there's so many different aspects. But yeah, if somebody asked me, "Hey, I want to grow in my Jewish spirituality, what should I do?" My first suggestion actually would be find a nigun you like and find a place to sing it once a day. You know. So, anyways, yeah, great. Thanks for asking that, Steve. Hi, Cheryl.
I just wanted to go back to something that Steve mentioned about being very careful about health now. And I think that as we grow older, it becomes apparent that if we had only done, it's like if I knew then what I know now, that kind of thing. And I think that with age and experience, you might become more careful about certain things and take less risks about certain things because you're more aware of the consequences. So I think age and experience have a lot to do with risk avergence and those kinds of things,
Right.
as far as from the health point of view.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's mostly good. We get wiser with age and we learn consequences that children don't understand. On the other hand, there may be cases where we've maybe taken away the wrong message that makes us risk averse because we had an experience where we got burned. And so we don't jump on other opportunities because we don't want to. I think what we want the least is to be duped. People hate being duped. And so we become skeptical of lots of people, every salesman is here to dupe us, right? Because I was duped once by a salesman, so every salesman is going to. So I wonder, like, how do we both learn, but also unlearn kind of from our bad experiences? Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I wanted to go back to something that just said, which triggered me back to the health business that when you said we've been duped, so we get burnt. Now, burnt is a perfect example of something that we all did. As we talk about it, how we were out in the sun without sunscreen or with baby oil or with reflectors in our day, and we did all of these things that we find that we're paying for now. So when we say to our children and our grandchildren, you need sunscreen, you don't want to turn out like this. And so I mean that's just prompted me. But I think that going back to your original question about unlearning something, just because something happened to you, if of course it wasn't life threatening or anything, you could give the benefit of the doubt that was just a solo experience or a solo individual who maybe took advantage. You can't, we suffer in humanity, and we tend to say that, okay, this happened, so I'm never going to do this again. And that could take away, you could be losing out on an opportunity to grow and learn and benefit from something that might have happened to you once because of a bad person or a bad situation. So you can't give it all up. You can't give it all up.
Yeah, awesome. Good. I love that. So I'll close with a story of an embarrassing story about myself, where I was a rabbinical student in New York and I was asked to do a wedding in, some sunny place. And so I went and I was so excited to leave rainy, cold New York in this sunny place that I spent the whole Shabbat afternoon before the wedding laying on the porch in the sun without any sunscreen. So comes wedding time, and here comes this wise rabbinical student walking to the chuppah like this because my whole body was burnt. My whole body was burnt to a crisp. But I and everyone, I heard everyone's whispers. They were so loud. Why is he walking like that? what's wrong with this guy? Like, where'd you find this rabbi, anyways? But I was born to a Chris, and I was almost 28 years old. I wasn't 7 years old. So unfortunately, people like me take a lot of times getting burnt to finally learn lessons. But so don't so a moral of the story: don't be like me. Have a great day, everyone. Great to see you.